All right, today we're going to continue our discussion of biodiversity by going over the lecture in chapter 18 of our books, which is uh, building off of our initial discussions of how biodiversity comes to be about and how biodiversity is relevant and important to talking about how we can conserve biodiversity. The case study for this chapter focused less on an individual case and more on just conservation efforts throughout history. For the most part, what we're going to see is that until about 50 years ago, there really wasn't a lot being done. We've done more in the last 50 years than we had in the previous 100. Definitely in terms of preserving biodiversity, it's definitely become a major issue, but that's also partially to the fact that we've been doing more in the last 50 years to that's been a detriment to biodiversity. So a couple of the big highlights that were brought up here was in the 1870s, Yellowstone becoming the first national park in the United States, which was a protected land. In Chapter 10 in land management, we'll talk about all the differences between national parks and wildlife refuges and protected areas when we cover that chapter. Teddy Roosevelt, during his presidency, set aside more land than any other president as protected land, 230 million acres. And then one of the more recent ones that occurred was in 2009, began in 2006 as an initiative under during George Bush's presidency, but finally finished in 2009, was the setting aside of about 215 million acres of marine habitat around the Hawaiian Islands as protected. Just a couple of examples of biodiversity's efforts to protect biodiversity. When we left off chapter 5, we were talking about the sixth mass extinction, and it's only appropriate that we begin talking about conservation of biodiversity by picking up here as well. Currently losing approximately 50,000 species per year during this extinction, which is a large number of species, and obviously losing any species consistently is not a good thing. And when we lose these species, we didn't really get a chance to define extinction, but extinct means that there are no longer any of a species in the world. Now, a species can go extinct because it evolves to a point where populations are so different that you actually get a new species because of some adaptation, some traits that are now present and repeating in that population that they become so different. But that's not the extinction we're really worried about. We're worried about the extinction being caused by a lot of things that are human related. So why care? Well, our research projects are going to show us that diversity is very important because there are so many different things we don't know about these different species. One reason being that inbreeding with similar genotypes, relatives, is not very good for genetic diversity. So if we lower population numbers and start driving species towards extinction and endangerment, we're lowering those gene pools, and that's not good. We do have these different categories of endangerment. Extinct means no known species exist today. Threatened means high risk of extinction, and there's no real numbers we're going to worry about, at least right now, for these. But they're all classified based on, case-to-case basis, because obviously some populations exist in higher numbers than others. So threatened species means a high risk of extinction. A near threatened species means likely to become threatened in the future, and least concern means that they're widespread, abundant, and we're not concerned with them in terms of loss of biodiversity. This chart gives you an idea of where we stand in terms of most species. You see that birds, about 20%, about 32% for mammals, and the amphibians one is a little bit shocking at about 50%, mostly because of the destruction of habitats where we would find amphibians. So what causes the loss of biodiversity? This is our wheelhouse for this chapter, is what are we worried about? And it's this acronym we can use called HIPCO. Habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, climate change, overharvesting. Notice that 1, 2, 3, 4, all 5 things can be linked to human activity, hence the stress of the sixth mass extinction being related to human interactions and human activity. So habitat loss is arguably the greatest cause of decline and extinction because we are physically destroying habitats, mostly due to human development, things like clear cutting, deforestation, overlogging, this converting of lands for agriculture, strip mining, the building of destruction of natural landscapes for things like hydroelectric dams, albeit a natural or a renewable resource, does still destroy local habitats where these things are found in. Any place that physically leads to the destruction of habitats is going to lead to a lack of biodiversity. Now you can see, based on this chart, so the dark green areas are where we have increases in forest cover. And a lot of that, you look at it, is in some pretty developed parts of the world. You might say to yourself, how are they increasing in forest cover in developed parts of the world? Where actually, well, these areas all used to be forested. And now the push has been to plant more trees to get them to, restore some of the forested areas here. The red is the problem. The red is forested areas that are being that are decreasing in terms of the amount of forest cover, i.e. loss of natural habitat. And look where they are in parts of the world. Highly forested areas, sub-Saharan Africa, the Amazon, our little tropical areas here in Southeast Asia, across Eastern Europe and Russia. These are areas where we have a large amount of forest cover, and a good thing, meaning it's no changes, no news is good news, but all of those red areas are not good because those are hotspots of biodiversity where we have a lot of species and we're losing forest cover in these areas because of human activities, overlogging and development for mostly farmlands. The I stands for invasive species. Now, an invasive species is an alien species or an exotic species, basically something that's not from there, something that's not natural. It becomes an invasive species when it spreads out in its new habitat and it turns out to be better suited than the native species because it disrupts food webs, it disrupts the physical environment sometimes, it changes the habitats, which could lead to affecting not just the competitors for that niche in that ecosystem, but it could also affect the other organisms that are there that are reliant on that as part of that species as part of its food web. So a couple of examples here. We'll talk about more of these in class. One of the activities we're going to do is going to be involved doing a little bit of research on invasive species. But the kudzu vine, zebra mussels, silver carps. Here you see the kudzu vine, which can grow in pretty much any areas that it's introduced to. Zebra mussels, the same thing. They can be very well adapted. I'm not going to get too much into invasive species right now. We'll spend more time in class and doing some research on particular ones here. But the point being that the invasive species are just able to grow in these areas, and they're better at growing there, and they can knock out the plant or wildlife populations and different species and lower the species richness of the areas by basically taking over all of these different roles and niches in the environment where we would find those native species. Pollution, so any kind of contaminants change the abiotic factors of the habitat. So pollution is a pretty obvious one. It changes the habitat, the physical habitat itself, allowing, it could kill organisms, could lower their survivability, could allow for invasive species to take over, all because it's changing that habitat. Climate change, obviously a big human one, would affect temperature and precipitation, more abiotic factors for different habitats. Again, changing habitats will impact survivability. Overharvesting, the simple overhunting, overfishing, killing of animals has led to their extinction. We saw it with the dodo bird was overhunted, the American bison, passenger pigeons, because they were in large populations and eventually were not regulated in any way, shape, or form, which led to their eventual extinction from over harvesting. So a couple of the acts that help to, the reason we talk about laws and acts is because one of the best ways to combat and preserve biodiversity is with legislation. It's one of our biggest tools in environmental science in preserving biodiversity. It's basically constructing laws that help these organisms and protect them in some way. The Lacey Act was one of the earliest ones. What the Lacey Act did was prohibit the transport of harvested game animals, birds, and mammals across state lines into and out of the United States. You were not able to illegally harvest. So we're talking about things that poachers might that our poachers are very popular in trying to get in parts of the world. This protected these organisms from being hunted, because if it became illegal to harvest them, hunt them, collect things from them that would be worth selling, then it decreased the demand for certain things, and people were less likely to take risks by going after it. The CITES was the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Again, CITES, it's much easier to say than all of that. This was designed to control international trade of threatened plants and animals. It's an international agreement. About 175 countries of the world recognize it today. What this does is prevent threatened plants and animals, things that are on the endangered species list, from being traded, captured, moved between country to country. Basically, these things have to stay in their natural habitat and be protected, or facing swift penalties. The red list is basically the worldwide list of what are considered the threatened species. Now, each country has its own way to monitor and regulate import-export of animals on this list. There is no global blanket answer for some of these individual countries, which means that some countries have more lax regulations, which does not help. But again, the fact that there is a list, there is a red list of threatened species, endangered species, does at least keep these organisms safer in terms of that they are getting special recognition and attention. Some more conservation legislation. The United States passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which prohibits killing of marine mammals in the U.S. and import-export of marine mammal body parts into or out of or within the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act was basically, once we realized that certain marine mammals are considered what are called keystone species, like the sea otter here. You take the sea otter out of the population and the sea urchin population skyrockets, because the sea otters are one of the few organisms that can eat sea urchins and control their population numbers. The Endangered Species Act, basically U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is able to list species as threatened or endangered and prohibit the harming of these species, made trade illegal, and it basically allows the government to create and purchase habitat critical to that species' survival based on this Endangered Species Act. In 1992, we had the International Convention on Biological Diversity. It was basically a bunch of countries coming together and saying we need to do something about biodiversity. Had three objectives: obviously conserving, sustainably using, and equitably sharing benefits from commercial use of genetic resources such as pharmaceutical drugs. Because again, the idea is that we're conserving biodiversity because a lot of plants have been shown to show medical efficacy. So this was one of the things that came out of that, is that we're all going to work together to share in the protection. We should also be able to share in the rewards from said discoveries of biodiversity. Size, shape, and connectedness. So aside from legislation, the other thing that can be done is the creation of these habitats, these zones, where rather than just trying to protect an individual species, which is what some of those laws are, one of the other options is to try and protect entire ecosystems, entire areas. So creating these protected areas. There are a couple of things that go into the creation of them. One of the things is it's not good to just section off an area and make that protected, because what happens is the smaller you break up these protected areas, you get what's called edge habitats, where a grassy field might meet a forest, something like that. So the more you section off, the more edge habitats you're going to have. And while there are organisms that live in one or the other, the edge habitat is its own ecosystem. So when you're actually trying to help by sectioning off an area and creating more of these boundaries, what you actually end up doing is creating more edge habitats, and that could potentially drive problems. The alternative to that is basically a biosphere reserve, where you have a core area that's protected, which has the least amount of human interaction, you have buffer zones around that ecosystem. So you don't have a hard edge to the habitat, but you have a buffer zone where you might have some small human interaction, and then you have these transition areas where you can have human development, settlements. What this does is allow for the prevention of edge habitats that would limit two distinct ecosystems and create a third one that might not be as beneficial to the organisms in either one. So this is our quick little conservation of biodiversity lecture. What we're going to focus really on is the different, we'll focus on the individual portions of HIPCO as we go through this year. We'll focus on the land management and the conservation stuff as we get into more chapters on lands management and creating these different areas. So see you all in class. Hope you've enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.